Hello and welcome to the Asian Peace Talks. This is a podcast series launched by the Asian Peace Program of the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. The goal of the Asian Peace Program is a noble one, to try to preserve and strengthen peace in Asia. With our limited resources, we have to take a modest approach. Nonetheless, just as a small acupuncture needle can make a big difference, we hope that our monthly policy essays and this new podcast series will make a big difference and strengthen the peace regimes in Asia. I'm Kishore Mahbubani, the host of the Asian Peace Talks. For the fourth episode of this podcast series, we are delighted to interview Singapore's former Foreign Minister, Mr. George Yeo. George Yeo has had a distinguished career in government and in the private sector. He served 23 years as a minister in the Singapore government, during which he helmed many key positions such as Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Trade and Industry. He worked with Amartya Sen and others to revive the ancient Buddhist university, Nalanda University in Bihar, India, and became its second chancellor. After leaving government in 2011, he joined the private sector. From 2013 to 2020, he was also appointed by Pope Francis to various committees overseeing improvement in the Vatican's financial administration. George Yeo is a keen student of global politics, especially that of the United States and China. During his time in government, he helped to drive a number of policies, including deepening Singapore's ties with both the US and China. We are therefore very happy to have him with us today. Thank you, George, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Kishore. I'm waiting to be needled.
No, this is a friendly podcast. Okay, George. As you know, the main goal of the Asian Peace Program is to preserve or strengthen peace in Asia. To do this, we have to address the main challenges to peace in Asia. And clearly, the biggest challenge to peace in Asia today is the growing geopolitical contest between the US and China. I hope that in this podcast with you, we will help our listeners understand better what are the deeper sources of this geopolitical contest, and at the same time, suggest ways and means of either managing it or diminishing it to ensure that it doesn't disrupt too many lives in this region. Given your long experience and understanding of both countries, the US and China, I have no doubt that our listeners will benefit a lot from your views and perspectives on all the dimensions of this contest, including the economic, political, military, and perhaps even the cultural dimension. So I'm going to begin by asking you about the economic dimension. Many Americans see the rise of the Chinese economy as a major threat to the US. Indeed, President Biden himself confirmed this when he said China has an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. And then he added, "That's not going to happen on my watch," unquote. Now, Biden seemed to imply that the main goal of the Chinese in growing their economy was to surpass the US. But what China is actually trying to do is to improve the well-being and standard of living of its own people, whose per capita income is still around $10,000, around 1/6 of the US. And if China succeeds in improving the well-being of its people, if the per capita goes up to, say, around 17,000, China will have a bigger GNP than the US. So my first question to you, therefore, is this. Is it wise for the Americans to suggest that they should oppose China's efforts at economic growth, which means that they'll also be opposing China's efforts to improve the well-being of their people? How do you respond to this?
Well, whether justified or not, this sentiment is real and it's reached a certain febrile state in the last few years. It's not as if China's re-emergence on the global stage was an explosion. It has been continuing for many years now. But like the litmus suddenly changing color upon the last few drops of acid, for some reason, in the last few years, a qualitative change has taken place in the US and to some extent in the entire West about the rise of China and its comprehensive re-emergence in all fields. Economically, I think China has, in total terms, has probably already surpassed the US. PPP is a better measure of that than nominal GDP. But even in nominal GDP, short of nuclear war, China will overtake the US within 10 years. But China's per capita will still be much less than that of the US for many years to come. And on many dimensions, the US will continue to lead the world in technology, in financial markets, in the sophistication of its economy and systems, in entertainment and software, and so on. China frightens the US not because it threatens the US, but it threatens US dominance in the world. So in areas where the US in the past had full flexibility to do what it wanted, increasingly it's got to take China into account and to exercise more self-restraint. So we must expect that it will take time for the US to adjust to this new balance in the world. In the nature of things, it must be preceded by a period of resistance. And that's what we are seeing today. I would say that's the reason why President Biden made that particular remark.
No, I completely agree with you that there'll be resistance. But at the same time, many Americans actually believe that in one way or another, a larger Chinese economy will disrupt and in some ways be harmful to their livelihoods. I don't see that happening. So how do you explain to the sort of the average, ordinary, what they call the American Joe, how do you explain to him that a larger economy for China doesn't mean that American livelihoods will be disrupted?
The economics of trade, the benefits of trade, these are known to everybody. I mean, this is economics 101. But that's not what's bothering the US. What's bothering the US is that in a number of fields, particularly those touching on national security, China is catching up. And maybe in some areas, even overtaking the US. And therefore, conscribing US freedom of action. That's difficult for the US to accept. You take, for example, what Edward Snowden revealed to the world about the PRISM project, which enabled the US to virtually tap any conversation anywhere in the world. With the emergence of Huawei, suddenly many drawers can no longer be opened by the US. And that's very uncomfortable. But this is something we've all got to live with. It's going to become a multipolar world sooner or later. And we can't have big powers accessing all drawers. In the case of Singapore, little as we are, we've got to accept that everybody will want to surveil us, and we just have got to do what we can to protect ourselves.
I completely agree with you. It's about the loss of domination that is the critical factor here. But I'm glad that you began by mentioning trade. That's going to be my second area of questions, which is about the trade war that has been launched by the US against China. And what's interesting is that during the election campaign, President Biden himself said that Trump's trade war against China had not worked. He said in 2019, quote, President Trump may think he's being tough on China. All that he's delivered as a consequence of that is America's farmers, manufacturers, and consumers are losing and paying more. His economic decision-making is so short-sighted and as short-sighted as the rest of his foreign policy. Unquote. Biden said that the trade war didn't achieve anything. In fact, it harmed Americans. And yet, when he took office, he couldn't reverse course. So how would you then try to persuade the Americans that maybe in this area, Joe Biden is right, that he should actually stop the trade war with China and stop all these tariffs and sanctions on China? How would you persuade the Biden administration to do that?
Well, to me, the trade imbalances, which is a reason given for some of the actions the US is taking against China on the trade front, is the result of profound changes which have been taking place in the US economy in the last few decades and the hollowing out of manufacturing. Maurice Chang of TSMC said recently that the US has lost its manufacturing culture. If I were an American,
that's a very strong statement.
If I were an American, I would be alarmed. The US is very strong in software, in finance, in entertainment, in agriculture. But when it comes to manufacturing, they used to be the best in the world. General Motors, General Electrics. But one by one, they've been hollowed out. Perhaps the free trade agenda was too unthinkingly applied. And there's always been an aversion to industrial planning in the US. But without some planning, without some state direction, you can easily lose out manufacturing. If you compare Singapore to Hong Kong, we have maintained a manufacturing core in Singapore. And that's because the government has been actively working on it. Hong Kong did not. Hong Kong can no longer make things. And it may not affect Hong Kong very much. But for the US, your comprehensive capability, and in times of crisis like COVID, depends upon your strength in manufacturing. And certainly in the national security field, in rocketry, in military weaponry, you cannot afford to lose your manufacturing capability. The difficulties faced by Boeing in recent years to me is very troubling. And I've been talking about this to my American friends. But how do you reverse this? It is not easy. It will take time. And this insecurity about itself, about its own capability, which accounts for part of the reason why China is being viewed as such a threat.
You know, I'm glad that you emphasize what Maurice Chung just of TSMC said, right? That America is losing its manufacturing culture or ethos, you know. And it points to a critical fact in the US-China relationship, which is the Americans don't take into account that the imbalance today within China and the US, let's say in manufacturing, is a result of deliberate policies that have been made by China, and as a result also of a lack of attention that the United States has paid to these manufacturing issues. So the problems, therefore, the United States has are not a result of what China has done, but also what the United States has failed to do domestically in terms of adapting and adjusting its economy to deal with the new challenges that are coming. So in some ways, many of the problems of the United States today are homegrown, and the United States should therefore do a bit of self-reflection of what it can do to strengthen itself, its own society, and its own economy. I want to add an additional note here that, you know, you spend time with the Harvard Business School, with some of the best minds in the United States. If you were sitting around talking to them, what advice or suggestions would you give to them on what America can do to strengthen itself in dealing with China and not just focus on beating up China?
To go back to your earlier point, I don't think you can take China out from the equation. I was in Doha when China was admitted to the WTO in November 2001. There was great celebration. But the Chinese at the time felt bruised by the negotiating process. The US, working in concert with the Europeans and the Japanese, extracted the maximum from China. And I remember a few years later suggesting to China that they join the TPP. The commerce minister held up his hands and said, "We have given in so much. We can't afford to do this." No one expected that from 2001 to end of 2019, before COVID, that the Chinese economy would grow 7 times in PPP terms, 9 times in renminbi terms, and 11 times in US dollar terms. And the
Can
growth...
you please repeat that one more time, please?
7 times in real terms, 9 times in renminbi, and 11 times in USD.
Wow.
No one expected it, not the Chinese themselves. And it has caused the economic division of labor in the world to be changed dramatically. And China became the most important trading partner for the majority of countries in the world, and certainly for all of us in Southeast Asia. And they become the most vertically integrated economy, which is how they're able now to talk about a dual circulation economy and an internal circulation which can be largely self-sufficient in times of crisis. No other country comes close to China in terms of the extent of this vertical integration. But the US has got to decide what are its strengths and weaknesses. Its greatest strength is in its institutions, especially in the entire ecosystem for tech startups, in software, in bioengineering, in biomedical sciences, in its efficient allocation of capital in its financial markets, and in its protection of property, which made it easy for people to invest, to buy and sell. But most importantly, until recently, was in its ability to troll the entire world for talent. When you watch NASA control room, when they have a successful space mission, and you scan the faces, they represent the United Nations. When Ingenuity, the little helicopter, which flew for the first time on Mars, The lady who led that program came from Myanmar. And when you watch an equivalent scene in China, they're all Chinese faces.
Yes.
Lee Kuan Yew used to tell visiting American dignitaries that the U.S. greatest strength was while China could draw on 1+ billion people for talent, the U.S. drew from 7 billion people.
Yes.
But that increasingly is not what it's becoming.
Yeah.
And that would be the greatest self-injury that the U.S. can inflict on itself.
I'm so glad that you began your response by talking about how beaten the Chinese felt in Doha, about the number of concessions they had to make to join the WTO. And while initially it was clearly painful for the Chinese, it turned out to be a huge gift. And in some ways, President Xi Jinping confirmed this in a speech he gave in Doha in January 2017 when he said, when we plunge into the ocean of globalization, we struggled to swim, we drank a lot of water, but we became stronger. And so China's economic strength today is therefore a result of a fairly monumental struggle to compete in the world. And so for the last question on the economic dimension before we turn to the political dimension, do you think that the United States itself may today have to go through a painful process, in some ways of reinventing itself to make it once again competitive in areas where it's clearly lost its competitiveness?
Well, the U.S. in its history has reinvented itself many times, has gone through deep holes, but crawled out of those holes and performed spectacularly. So those of us who have an affection from the U.S. feel in our bones that they have this spirit in them. Before Obama was elected, no one believed that a black man could be elected as president in the U.S.
That's right.
He became president, and for 2 terms.
Yes.
The U.S. is always full of surprises. So while, yes, there are deep problems in the U.S., and one worries a lot for it, there is a certain hope that given the usefulness of the culture, that somehow it can right itself. But you can never be sure, and one can take bets on this.
Yes, I agree with you. But as you know, the tragic sequel to the 8 years of Obama was that we got 4 years of Trump, which was in some ways a tragedy, and we can discuss that later. But I'm going to turn now to the political dimensions of the US-China contest. Because many American leaders, when they speak about China, state either explicitly or even imply in their remarks that the communist ideology of the Chinese government is a direct threat to the United States. Yet, at the same time, we in Southeast Asia know that China stopped exporting communism since Deng Xiaoping visited Southeast Asia, and especially after our former Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, told Mr. Deng Xiaoping, how can we become your friend if you continue to support communist parties in Southeast Asia? So China has now stopped exporting communism for probably over 40 years now. How do we persuade the United States, therefore, that China, while it poses challenges in many areas, including the economic dimension that we spoke about, does not pose an ideological threat to the US? How do we explain that to the Americans?
I would say that China is more Chinese than communist. And that if communism has taken root in China, is because its tenets are in alignment with Chinese history, tradition, and philosophy. So the color red has always been important in Chinese culture. Dialectical materialism is nothing surprising to the Chinese. That's always been the way they look at history.
Part of Chinese philosophy.
And Taoism. So China is Chinese. And the reason why China is because it has a long tradition of centralized rule and run by a continental-sized bureaucracy, the Mandarinate. In fact, it was China which invented examinations and invented the civil service, institutions which are now universal. So in a sense, we can see China's future, a lot of it, in its past. And this hope that somehow the West can influence China to become more Western is ahistorical and illusory. But more than that, Imagine if China were to become another advanced Western country. Imagine if it would begin to deploy gunboats in different parts of the world and to adopt a muscular diplomacy and to begin judging others by its own templates. Imagine if China became like the US, believing in its own historical exceptionalism and its own manifest destiny. I think there will be a titanic struggle between these two superpowers. It is a happy circumstance that China is not like the US, because we can only afford one superpower in the world with a manifest destiny. To have two must mean a clash. China is too old, too wise, has seen too much of life to want to think that others can be like themselves. They're like a big family, full of troubles within. And when they meet another family, they say, all the best to you. Not for them to say, look, let me tell you how to run your family. I can't even run mine properly. And someone else comes to the house and says, look, let me solve your problems for you. You invite him down for a drink and then send him off. Listening politely to all his advice, but finding that none is of value to you. That is China today. I don't think it has any wish to export its model or its ideology or its philosophy. But coupled to that is a certain cultural arrogance. It's almost akin to Jewishness. The Chinese don't believe that if you're not born a Chinese, that you can ever become Chinese. You can say, oh, I can speak your language. I like your history. I enjoy your food. They look at you and they'll be very pleased and they'll say thank you, but in their hearts, they know you're not Chinese. And there's no need for you to become Chinese. So this is very deep. It's not only among members of the elite. It is among ordinary Chinese. And the way they deal with non-Chinese is with a certain mix of condescension and fear. So they ply you with courtesy, with good food, and then send you off. And they will not let you into the inner chambers because that's for themselves.
I'm so glad that you explained that so clearly, that China essentially will be Chinese. Because, in the American narrative, and what shocks me about the United States is that it is a country that is very diverse in opinions and divided on everything. But the only thing that the Americans seem to agree on about China, and I'm not even exaggerating, but it's been put in an article by our friend Kurt Campbell in Foreign Affairs, that China has disappointed America by not becoming democratic. And, I think it was Graham Allison, the Harvard professor whom you know, who said, be careful what you wish for. Because seriously speaking, if China had a liberal, open, democratic system, it would become far more nationalist, I think, in many ways. Become like a Western power, sending out gunboats around the world and so on and so forth, as you said. So in some ways, therefore, when the United States keeps pressing China to change its political system. And as you know, Biden just said at the G7 meeting, this is a contest between democracies and autocracies, implying that democracies are good and autocracies are bad. But actually, Chinese autocracy has succeeded in creating a responsible government that takes care of its people and makes sure that China doesn't disrupt the global order. If you are, again, sitting in a room full of Americans, how do you persuade them that actually it is in America's national interests to see the continuation of the current government in China rather than the removal of the current government in China?
The question is, whatever the nature of government in China, would the US prefer to see a stronger China or a weaker China? And by strength, I refer not only to economics, but also to technology and military capability. I think the US concern is not with the type of government in China, but how strong China is and to what extent it challenges America's dominance in the world. Can America weaken China? It can try. I don't think it will succeed because Chinese growth now is organic and self-sustaining. China's strengths are also its weaknesses. When it's well organized, its achievements are awesome. When it is disorganized, its failures are also awesome. And this is the story of the long cycle of Chinese history.
Yes.
So one day, China will go into decline. Corruption will bring it into decline quickly. This is what Xi Jinping has succeeded to reverse in China. It was already in decline. Can Xi Jinping succeed to keep this reversal continuing? Well, let us see. But China's history has a deep internal dynamic which outsiders can rarely affect in a major way. In the same way, whether the US is strong or weak depends not on China, but depends principally on itself. Which is why I advise my Chinese friends, I say, look, one important reason why the US takes this attitude towards China is because of its own insecurity. And it is in China's interest to help the US resolve some of its problems. Not in an interfering way, but just by being not unhelpful. Without taking sides. Because a US which is more self-confident will interact with China in a more balanced, comprehensive manner. And then we are more likely to achieve the goal of a multipolar world in the nearer term without the punctuation of war and crisis.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. That is actually in the interests of China and actually in the interest of the whole world to see a strong, self-confident America rather than the somewhat insecure America that we are seeing today. I mean, the American people are deeply troubled. All the surveys and data shows that very clearly. And because of that sense of insecurity, it's also likely to do things that might end up being dangerous. And here I want to bring up the most dangerous issue in the US-China relationship, which of course is Taiwan. And one reason why there has been relative stability between US and China on the Taiwan issue is that since the days of Kissinger and Nixon, especially since the days of the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1979, the understanding was that Washington, D.C. would deal officially with Beijing and unofficially with Taiwan. And that held the peace for a long time. The Trump administration tried to change that. Pompeo wanted to send officials from the Trump administration to Taiwan. And some people in the Biden administration may also be tempted to do that. So on the question of Taiwan, how do you explain again to an American audience that it is actually a very dangerous issue and that the United States should be very careful about shifting away from an understanding that has held the peace on Taiwan for so long?
Kissinger has repeatedly recounted his conversations with Zhou Enlai on US-China relations and how whenever they explored other areas, Zhou Enlai came back to Taiwan. And there was agreement only because the US accepted that there was one China. So that is bedrock. It is not a card. If you play the bedrock as if it is a card, then the structure upon which an edifice is built can rapidly collapse. Now, it may be that subsequent administrations have forgotten or have changed their minds. So from China's perspective, there must be no ambiguity. And they've made it very clear that even if it means war, so be it. On the US side, they see advantage in strategic ambiguity. That we will not say whether we will intervene or not intervene if China were to intervene militarily in Taiwan, because that helps maintain the peace. Yes, if one is absolutely unambiguous and the other is ambiguous, then you can maintain that twilight zone for a while longer. And that was how we gotten through many years of the 20th century. Now you have new administrations who are playing around. I think under Biden, is an experienced crew under Secretary Blinken and Jack Sullivan and others. I think they're more careful. And they said, we have relaxed self-imposed restraints. In other words, we're not doing anything which we agreed to. We have relaxed self-imposed restraints. And we have put in stronger guardrails. When I read that, I say, that's very carefully constructed, very cunning. And so long as those guardrails are forward of Chinese red lines, then we can breathe a sign of relief. Recently, just before the G7 summit, at Blinken's request, he had a conversation with Yang Jiechi. And of course, both sides have to say what they had to say. But in the Chinese account, it ended with Blinken affirming the Shanghai Communique, the Shanghai Agreement, and the 3 subsequent communiques. I read the Western media reports, not mentioned. But my conclusion as an old professional in this area is the whole purpose of the conversation was to tell China we have not shifted from the Shanghai Accord and the 3 communiques. Now, if that's really the case, then the danger of war is not high. Then what we must now do is, on this basis, find a way to coordinate rules of engagement so that accidents don't happen on the high seas. But if the US departs from that core position, then all bets are off.
Well, I'm really glad that you've given our listeners a little piece of good news, because most of the time when we discuss US-China relations, we talk about things getting worse, more difficult. But on Taiwan, I completely agree with you that the Biden administration has recommitted itself to the 3 communiques and to the Shanghai also joint statement. Then I think that's a very positive move, and that I think will help to prevent the Taiwan issue from going off the rails, and that's very important. But at the same time, the one constituency in Washington, D.C., I know for a fact that is deeply troubled by the rise of China or return of China is the national security community, especially Pentagon and the U.S. military, because they used to enjoy overwhelming military superiority over every other power in the world. But now when the Pentagon does its war games in scenarios, East Asia, they find themselves losing against the Chinese military. In fact, a former Pentagon officer told me this face to face. So I know this to be a fact. So this constituency, and I ask you, especially since you spent some time in the military yourself, how do you persuade the US military that China's military buildup does not represent a threat to the US military?
The Indo-Pacific Command, or formerly the SingPac Command, have done their war games. And they know that without the use of nuclear weapons, it's not easy for them to prevail in the East or South China Seas. So one reason why they've broken off the intermediate ballistic missile agreement with Russia is so that they can deploy these in East Asia, maybe on Guam and on countries which are prepared to let them, although I'm not sure if any country would allow them, even Australia. Because if you allow the deployment of nuclear weapons to hit China, then you must expect to be targeted. And if Australia decides to take this course of action, there must first be a full domestic discussion about whether this is a move Australia will want to take. It's for this reason that about 1 to 2 months ago, Xi Jinping went to Hainan to launch 3 ships, 3 naval ships. It was not as if he had a lot of time to spare. They were chosen for the symbolisms. One was a helicopter carrier, which is a signal to the Taiwanese that we can land forces deep into Taiwan, which is mountainous. Second was a destroyer or cruiser, I can't remember now. And that's to extend the range of the Chinese Navy deeper into the Pacific. But the real signal was in the third, which was the launch of a new submarine, which carries submarine-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles with multiple separately targeted warheads, which can reach the entire continental US. And it's a very quiet diesel submarine, which can spend a long time underwater in the deep Pacific. So this gives the Chinese a counter-strike capability, and therefore will put restraint on the ability of the Americans to threaten nuclear escalation with China. And conveniently, in the pen nearby, there were 2 similar submarines afloat for reporters to take note of. So these are little signals that each side is sending to the other that, look, if we go down this path, no one wins, everyone loses. And therefore work within these constraints.
Well, on the nuclear front, I'm actually very puzzled that the Americans accuse the Chinese of being belligerent on the nuclear weapons front, because the Americans have about 6,000 nuclear warheads and China has 250. I mean, that's an amazing imbalance. And I don't understand why the Americans don't want to keep it that way instead of encouraging a nuclear weapons race.
It's not numbers. It is China's ability to have a second strike capability, which the US is not happy with. And this was reflected in the statement made by the head of NATO, Stoltenberg, before the summit. He said China is increasing its production of nuclear warheads. And as you've just said, China has very few compared to the US.
Yeah.
But these new warheads have got great capabilities. And he also said China is attempting to have a triad. A triad meaning ballistic missiles launched from land, air, and sea. Land and air ballistic missiles are easier to defeat. But sea-launched missiles are trickier. But I was quite surprised that the head of NATO spoke as if an objective of NATO is to deny China a triad capability.
I must say, I was very puzzled that NATO, which stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, wants to change its name to North Pacific Treaty Organization. That's the impact of what Stoltenberg was saying. But, since you mentioned Hainan, and Hainan, as you know, is in the South China Sea. In fact, Hainan was the place where an American spy plane had to land after it had a crash with a Chinese jet fighter. So the one area that obviously we in Southeast Asia worry about is the South China Sea. And here, I must say, one source of confusion, as you know, has been the Chinese 9-dash line in the South China Sea. How do you explain the 9-dash line to the people around the world? What is the message that China is trying to send with the 9-dash line?
The PRC inherited the 9-dash lines from the previous Kuomintang government. It cannot disavow the claims which were made earlier and formally made by the KMT government in 1947 after the end of the Second World War. But the claims, in fact, preceded that. China had already made similar claims in the 30s. And when the Japanese invaded China in July 1937, it scooped up those islands as part of its conquest of China. And that was years before Pearl Harbor. And after the end of the Second World War, when civil war broke out in China again, it was the US which helped Taiwan occupy some of those islands.
Help the Kuomintang government.
Helped the Kuomintang government.
Yes.
So the reason why Taiping Island is called Taiping Island, I read, is because the US ship which carried the KMT troops there was the USS Pacific, which means Taiping.
I see. So it's named after an American vessel.
And I was told by Taiwanese friends that up to the 60s, when US Navy ships conducted surveys in the South China Sea, they sought permission from Taipei. But of course, if you are Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia or Brunei, you say, look, how can this be reasonable? How can China's 9-dash line comes right
So
up
close.
to our coast? Just because we were not independent yet and could not speak for ourselves. And our colonial predecessors took no notice. So China has to take regard of the fact that, yes, it's inherited the 9-dash lines from the previous government, but that Southeast Asian countries abutting the South China Sea also have reasonable arguments. And in some ways, UNCLOS was very clear that it doesn't touch on territorial rights. But UNCLOS does say that you're entitled to an EEZ. So if those islands are not really fully islands, they're just features, then my EEZ should not be questioned. Now, I don't expect any country involved to say, look, I give up my claims because the domestic publics won't accept it. So the only way is negotiation. So the code of conduct, which I hope will be concluded quickly between ASEAN and China, will at least regulate the rules of engagement to prevent disputes from getting crisis, and also to work on joint development of resources. Make it win-win cooperation. I believe there's sufficient incentive for all the parties to pursue a more peaceful course of action.
I share your hope that at the end of the day, there'll be some kind of negotiated, peaceful resolution of this issue.
You see, the problem when we try to bring in the US to help our case is that very quickly you find that we're just a pawn on the larger chessboard.
I completely agree with you. It'd be a mistake to get other powers involved. We have, I think, George, if you don't mind, another 5 minutes or so. In 5 minutes, I just want to briefly touch upon the cultural dimension. In some ways, you have done so already. When you've described how the Chinese believe that only the Chinese can be Chinese, and the Chinese don't have the kind of universalizing, messianic vision that the Americans have to make everyone an American kind of thing. So in that sense, since the Chinese have no desire to export Chinese civilization the way that Americans tried to export the American identity to the world, there should be no clash of civilizations in a sense. And yet, many Americans, in their gut feel, very threatened by the resurgence of Chinese civilization, Can you say just a little bit more to let's say to an American and say, even as Chinese civilization becomes strong, it's not going to change America. It's not going to try and change the world. How do you explain that?
Some of my Western friends say that it's hard to understand China. My reply to them is China is in fact quite predictable because it is too embedded in its own history. You can have conversations about a low carbon economy or about water control or about COVID. Mm-hmm. Very quickly, the Chinese go back to historical experiences. Mm-hmm. I was listening to a lecture given by the head of traditional Chinese medicine on the way they handled COVID in Wuhan. And they said, in the last 3,500 years, we have recorded, I think, 350 epidemics in China. Every one has been recorded. Wow. The nature of every epidemic and the response to it has been recorded. So he said, yes, every epidemic is new, and we do not know, we cannot predict its cause, but the symptoms are similar, and we have symptomatic treatment. There are people who say, look, China should not be damming its rivers to generate electricity or transferring water from the south to the north or from the west to the east or whatever. They've been doing it from way, way back. So there is great self-confidence that this can be done. And the reason why they've been able to do it is because they had paper. For centuries, they had paper. And they kept it a secret. And paper enables you to keep more information over a longer period of time across a vast distance than anybody else. So they kept records of floods, of comets, of eclipses, of pandemics. Say in Singapore, we are familiar with Shakespeare and with British writers. But if you say, well, what about Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Victor Hugo or Schiller? We've got to read them in translation. China has a bigger literature than all of Europe combined. And it is accessible to all Chinese people in the original language. This makes the civilization very conservative. It's very difficult for anyone governing China to escape China's history. And therefore, China should not be a mystery to those who are observing what's happening there.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because in some ways, the Europeans have a better sense of history than the Americans do because they've been around a bit longer than the United States. But even they today, surprisingly, have begun to share some of the American concerns about China. If you had to give a separate, specific message to the Europeans, what would you say to them about, hey, you've been around as long as China, you know what China is or isn't?
The Europeans are practitioners of realpolitik. And interestingly, there is a criticism which has been leveled against Kissinger among many Americans, that he's too much of a European. The Europeans did not become realpolitik practitioners by choice, but by bitter historical experience. Yeah. So they know that there are limits to power and that nothing is forever. And you look around, manage the risk. So while the Americans may want there to be a Western alliance against China, and this banner of democracies versus autocracies may look very grand, it's not a practical guide to action. The British and Americans and the other three eyes may have much more in common, and they have shed blood together in many wars. But the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, they have different instincts. And instincts which the Chinese will exploit fully. Because what they want is a Europe which is separate from the Americans, which cannot be separated from the Americans because they are one civilization, but which acts to some extent autonomously as a separate pole. And I tell my European friends that Europe's role in keeping peace in the world is decisive. Europe is the great balancer, the great stabilizer. If Europe shifts a little one way as against the other, it can maintain peace. If it shifts the other way, it can help precipitate war. And this role Europe must play. And as an old civilization, I think it has the capability, the wisdom to play it well.
I agree with you. Now, in the 2 minutes that we have left, I want to briefly ask you a question on Singapore, because many of the people listening to this podcast, I guarantee you, will be our fellow Singaporeans. And of course, what makes Singapore very unique is that we are one of the few countries that are both comfortable in the Western club and also comfortable being members of Asian civilizations, So we can in some ways sort of bridge the East and West in a way that very few societies can do so. So how do you think Singaporeans can make a contribution in helping to minimize the growing misunderstanding between US and China or between China and the West? If you were to give a small suggestion for our fellow Singaporeans, what would you say?
We should be very alert to the cross currents and position ourselves carefully. It's not for us to determine the course of these currents. Or how they interact. These are forces way, way too big for us. Our job is to position ourselves safely so that 3.5 million Singaporeans' welfare are protected. And we do this best by being a part of ASEAN. ASEAN must always be the first circle of our diplomacy. And ASEAN gives us room to maneuver, gives us some influence in the region, and enables us to avoid being caught in between, because there's a larger raft to which we are only a part.
Thank you very much. That's a very optimistic note on which to end and a fascinating discussion. And I have absolutely no doubt, George, that especially for the listeners of this podcast, and we've got actually quite a few listeners now to our podcast from the United States and Europe, I know that they'll get fascinating new insights on how to view the biggest geopolitical contests of our time, US and China. And I do believe that if our listeners, especially the policymakers, heed your advice, then we may have made a small but perhaps important contribution to helping to keep peace in the world. And that's what the Asian Peace Program is about. Thank you very much, George.
Well, thank you, Kishore. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
Our pleasure. Thank you.